So why study the competitors? Well, we now know the scale of the opportunity, but how do you decide how much time and effort and money to invest in developing and making your product? For that, you need to develop goals and targets for engineering. And to set those targets, you need to know how the competitor products perform. Did they satisfy the customer needs? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And how do you compare? So again, we come back to Sun Tzu, and he said, know your enemy, know yourself, and victory is never in doubt. It's not quite that simple, but it's a good starting point. So first you need to figure out who your competitors are. An easy way to do that is brochure figure analysis. So brochure figure analysis is the easiest form of analysis because brochure figures by definition are publicly available. They're marketing data that your competitors have put out there, or maybe magazines have tested or something like that. And it's just free, and you can do as much analysis as you want. It's just your time. So you want to start at the beginning with all the possible players in the market, in the big market, not necessarily your selected niche. And all the data that the customer would use to compare the possible solutions. So here, for example, we could make some graphs of acceleration versus price, or driving range, or something like that. Then you want to narrow down that list of potential competitors. So in this situation, maybe I decide that I'm only focusing on a kind of specific price range, and actually I want to consider how the real customer would use the car. So I make up my own custom analysis, in this case 80% charge range. And that gives me a short list of competitors. And then you really want to figure precisely who are you going to be directly competing against, and that should give you ideally a list of somewhere between 3 and 6 competitors that you really want to focus on. If you've got a product in the market, you need to include that as a reference point. Maybe it's not exactly the same, but it's something that engineering can understand, and also sales and marketing as well. Also, it's very useful to include something above where you're going, maybe higher price or higher performance, and something below where you're aiming, lower price, lower performance. Because you don't want to be surprised by something above coming down or below coming up. So you need to understand fully a little bit outside your envelope. And if possible, you want to use forecast data of competitors' performance, because your product won't exist now, your product will exist in the future after you've built it. So it's no use knowing what happened in the past. For that, you need to know where they're going, how they're going to evolve. It's important to say, brochure data isn't enough. It's okay for selecting your key competitors, but you've got to remember that customers don't experience data. They have subjective, holistic experiences. Engineers need data. They need numerical specific targets. So you've got to find a way of translating the customer's subjective, holistic experience needs into numerical specific targets for engineers. And then when the engineers produce your product, you need to find a way of converting that performance into an experience for the customer to communicate to them. So next you need to do some benchmarking. For benchmarking, what you need is an expert in the product. Now that can be you, that could potentially be the CEO if you're in a very small company, but it should be someone who can evaluate the competitors from the point of view of all customers and users. Quite often you see with small startup companies, the CEO or the founders are making the decisions about the direction, and they're making valuations based on their own personality. And unless they're the only one buying the product, that's not a good way to go. So you need to have someone who can divorce themselves from personal opinion and not bring bias into analysis. You need to have someone who can explain their findings and the reasons why. And you need someone who can discuss those pros and cons both with sales and marketing in a way that's easy and understandable for someone who's non-technical, and with engineering, because engineering need to turn your findings into reality. So they need to then test all the competitors back to back like a customer in all the ways and scenes a customer uses the product. They need to give clear numerical ratings, because that's very understanding for engineering. And they need to be divided into subcategories that engineering can understand. And they need backup explanation why each rating was given. So I know quite a bit about this. I did this job for the car industry for more than 10 years. And I'll talk about that in another video. Then what you need to do is take those evaluations and you need to compare them to the customer priorities. So you should know the customer priorities from the surveys that we talked about in the previous video. And you need to take those priorities and put them in a structure that's something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, whether or not Maslow's hierarchy of needs is actually true doesn't really matter at this point, but the structure is very useful. So at the bottom, you have what's called deficiency needs. If you don't meet these needs, the customer will have anxiety or they will have a functional problem, a real world problem. And at the top are what Maslow called growth needs, and these provide positive, enriching experiences. And in our product world, that relates to emotions. So if you rank those customer priorities on that kind of scale, then you can put them in categories that should be recognizable by the customer, but designed to work on what engineering are going to be doing, and arrange them in that order and split between those positive emotional needs and those functional deficiency needs. And then combine that with the expert's benchmark, and you should end up with some sort of graph like this. And what you do with that is what we're going to cover in our next video, which is positioning.